Assalamu alaikum. This is Sabah Aslam, Executive Director of Islamabad Institute of Conflict Resolution, and we welcome you to the IICR Discourse on the regional issues and on the international issues concerning the security environment of the world. So today's topic is Gaza, the Moscow connection. And we have Shahid with us. He is one of the experts on the cyber security, and he have been with us in a team of IICR regarding the security issues and disinformation. So Shahid would be discussing the Gaza issue and its connection with the Moscow. So thank you, Shahid, for joining us in, and we are looking forward to learn from you on this topic. The floor is with you.
Thank you very much, Raza. Thank you. It's great being here. Thank you. So, should I begin?
Sure, please, you can.
Okay. So, I think it will be beneficial for the viewers if we discuss how this conflict is playing out. The Gaza conflict is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening, as I've explained in my article. It's part of a string of conflicts that are propping up in the Middle Eastern region. And they're not just happening in the Middle Eastern region. Obviously, we understand that in Eastern European region, new fault lines, new flashpoints are being created out of the Ukraine war. In order to correctly understand the situation in Gaza, we'll have to first understand what's happening in Ukraine and how that environment is linked to what's happening in the Middle East at the moment. First of all, back in the early 90s when Ukraine was created as an independent state. It was created under a condition that it would act as a buffer state between Moscow, between Russia, and NATO countries. So there's a buffer between the two, emerging powers, so they don't actually end up fighting each other. There's no pan-European war scenario. And that is why Ukraine was created as an independent entity. Belarus is also an independent entity, and these two countries collectively somehow incubate NATO from Russia and vice versa. So it's again, I mean, if you've read some historic material regarding Afghanistan and how Afghanistan was created in 1870s as a buffer state, it's the same political theory that's applicable here. Ukraine maintained its status as a partially neutral country for over 20 years. And during that period, Ukraine did experience economic growth. It enjoyed working relationships between Kiev, Moscow, and European capitals, because Ukraine at that time was a central geography between two superpowers. And it was able to leverage that position into, economic incentives, etc. But when we enter 2010, the political thought process in Ukraine starts to shift. And systematically, a thought process is initiated in Ukraine that, Ukraine probably doesn't need to be the Switzerland of Eastern Europe, doesn't need to be a neutral country. It needs to take sides, and it needs to join the European Union, maybe even NATO, and then become part of the Western Bloc. Now, that particular thought process, that particular aspiration by some portion of intelligentsia in Ukraine was not received very well in Moscow for understandable reasons. And I will briefly touch upon what those reasons are. If you see things from Russian angle, Russia views Ukraine as a buffer state. It doesn't see Ukraine as a bona fide sovereign country. Yes, Russia does recognize Ukraine as an independent state, at least in the pre-2010 construct, in the pre-2010 geopolitics of Eastern Europe. It did recognize Ukraine and, in fact, treated Ukraine as an independent country, but wanted to maintain Ukraine in its sphere of influence because it wanted to maintain a buffer between Russia and NATO. That was necessary because Russia, when the Soviet Union collapsed in early 90s, it led to a massive military imbalance, a massive capability gap between the new Russian Federation and NATO. It is also pertinent to mention that NATO was actually created to contain Russia. And when the Russian state figured out that even after the Soviet Union it collapsed, it was dismissed. Um, the Western Bloc did not actually dismantle NATO, and they started to believe that the NATO's new role will be to contain Russia. So the Western Bloc is not stopping at the disillusionment of Soviet Union, but they will continue to push forward in the geopolitical space until Russia is actively contained to a point that it can no longer exert influence as a major regional power, let alone a superpower. The best way you could do that is by bringing uh, military capability on Russia's borders. And that would be achieved by incorporation of Eastern European countries slowly into European Union and NATO architecture. Uh, Obviously, it goes without mention that NATO Article 5 mandates that every single NATO member country has to declare war in case of any NATO member state being attacked by a foreign adversary. So it creates a safety net for the member states, but it also creates this instability in regions where NATO operates because it leaves countries like Russia with very limited options. Um, in 2010, when this narrative is being actively promoted in Ukraine, that they should, give up neutrality and they should join NATO and be part of the European Union, maybe even Eurozone. Uh, Russia starts to see this as a threat. And they start to see this, if you look at the Russian discourse, they see it as a threat because if Ukraine joined NATO, the Russian capital, Moscow, and other major Russian population centers, because as much as 65% of Russia's population is actually centered around the Volga River. And the Moscow region. Russia is a sparsely populated country. It is the largest country in the world, but it is very sparsely populated. So as much as 65, even according to some accounts, 70% of its population is located around the Moscow, greater Moscow region, right? So having NATO forces just a few hundred kilometers away, I think it's from the closest points, it's around 2045 to 2050 kilometers away from Moscow, is not acceptable to Russia from a military point of view. They see it as a strategic threat because if there's a war in the future against NATO, they believe that Russia will be forced to fight on its own soil, and it will be forced to fight a very expensive defensive war because they will not be able to fight an offensive battle, which Russian military doctrine has always been all about fighting on a second territory, not on the Russian territory, right? So this thought process starts to create a flashpoint between Russia and Kiev, between Ukraine, right? And one thing leads to another. By 2014, the Russians come to realize that they will have to take active measures against Ukraine to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO and being part of the Western Bloc, bound by Article 5 of the NATO Charter, right? In order to do that, they obviously start carrying out activities within Ukrainian territory, but mostly in belts, in regions, borderlands, where Russian-speaking majority exists. So these are your Luhansk and Donetsk, and now Crimea regions as well. So the first section of the military strategy Russia applied was to create a buffer inside Ukrainian territory, and that they have successfully done so. There is a buffer between mainland Ukraine and Russia now, created inside of the Ukrainian territory, and that is the line where Russia has dug in, and they're waiting for the winter offensive by the Ukrainians, which is most likely going to be very expensive for Ukraine, because Russians are no longer fighting an offensive war in Ukraine until the coming summer. They will be most likely resorting to defensive maneuvers. They've established their defensive lines, and from behind their defensive lines, they will be carrying out long-range strikes against Ukrainian targets to continue the war. But they will not be taking out any major military offensive during the winter months. That is the expectation. That expectation in 2023, it connects with what's happening in Gaza right now. So first of all, at least I don't see what's happening in Gaza, as I've noted in my article, that this is not happening in isolation. This is not part of a vacuum. At least the regional countries who are concerned about how things are happening in the Middle East, especially with the Abrahamic Accords and how it gives complete impunity to Israel and doesn't actually give any tangible, quantifiable dividend to the Middle Eastern countries, that has created a schism inside the Middle East. And a lot of countries like Turkey, Iran, Syria, even to some extent Jordan, have been left out of the regional politics. So they are not part of the Abrahamic Accords. Yeah, they're at least not part of the core vertical of the Abrahamic Accords. So they feel left out. And when you see that Gaza, when it erupted on October 7th, it needs to be seen in the context of what's happening in Ukraine, right? So on one hand, the Russian forces are dug in Ukraine. They are waiting for the winter offensive by the Ukrainians. On the other hand, they have intervened in several African countries, like Burkina Faso, Mali, several other countries where anti-French movement has taken hold. It has led to several military coups, and now at least 3 countries in Africa, they want French companies to pay massive royalties rather than paying a small piece of royalty for high-end natural resources like uranium and sulfur and a lot of other rare earth minerals that French companies have been exploiting in Africa. So the Russians have also opened a secondary front in Africa against French interests, because they want to sort of take a slice out of that market of natural resources, because Russia needs it as well. Then we see that in the Middle East, Gaza erupts in October. Hamas launches a completely unexpected surprise attack against the Israeli forces, against Israeli military targets, and that offensive, according to most estimates, was not seen by Israel. They were not expecting it. That has led to the current conflict that is taking shape. But there is a difference, Sabah. This conflict is not normal. There's nothing normal about this conflict. First of all, the Gaza conflict is connected to regional powers. For example, we have observed that Houthi militia groups operating out of Yemen, they have declared war against Israel. Those groups have support from Iran. Iran is a close ally and now a major value chain supplier to the Russian military offensive in Ukraine, because they are supplying a lot of the equipment that Russian forces are using in Ukraine, and ammunition as well. And then there are players like Turkey who are sending signals that they could join the conflict. It doesn't mean that they will join the conflict in the classic sense of the word. They will not be sending their military forces, but they will be part of this conflict one way or the other, maybe covertly. Then there are countries like Jordan that have set clear red lines. They have said, okay, if you cause a second Nakba in Gaza, that will be seen by Jordan as an act of war. On the other hand, the Syrian government, they are seeing this in a completely different context. Lebanon is seeing this in a completely different context. Egypt has all of a sudden received a lot more leverage over the West, because Nothing can come in and out of the Rafah crossing without the Egyptian approvals. So we are seeing the sort of the ingredients of a larger, sustained, uh, asymmetric conflict in Middle East. This will not be a war like the 1948 or 1967 or the 1973. This will be a war. It is already a war. But I believe, as I've noted in my article, it will be Israel's Afghanistan. This conflict is not going to stop. It will not escalate either. It will not escalate to an unsustainable level, but it will also not end. It will continue. It will continue to a scale where the regional countries that want to contain Israel now, because for Russians to sort of send a message to the Americans or to gain some leverage on the Americans, the best way to do that is to attack Israel or Israeli interests, or to threaten Israel's apartheid in Gaza and West Bank. By the way, this is not a new tactic. If you peel the onion on 1967 war and 1973 war, same trend applies. Back then, the Soviet Union was using the threat of war against Israel against the US, so they have more negotiating power with Washington. So this is part of the grand, big country politics. It's the grand geopolitics level, and I think this is happening all over again. Although the only difference that we have seen is that the scale of the fighting is not going to look like a full-scale war. It will look more like how when Russian forces invaded Afghanistan, or when the Western countries, NATO, invaded Afghanistan, or even indeed Iraq. It will look like as I've again noted in my article, a 20-year conflict. There will be many phases in this conflict, in my opinion. There will be phases in which this conflict is very visible when a lot of fighting is taking place. Things are moving very fast, but there will be periods where not a lot of fighting is taking place, but a lot of politics is taking place, and then that will lead to another wave where a lot of violence is taking place and not a lot of politics is taking place. All in all, I think that this conflict is not going to end anytime soon. And the reason why I sort of wrote that article is because people in Pakistan, especially our decision makers in Pakistan, they need to realize that this conflict is not like any other conflict. And if Pakistan, being a member of OIC, and because regional countries, Arab countries, are quite close to Pakistan, typically quite close to Pakistan, we will be involved one way or the other. We might not be involved actively, but there is a humanitarian angle to what Pakistan can do for Gaza. I've heard recently that over 1,000 Pakistani doctors are traveling to Gaza to take part. Pakistan has sent some humanitarian aid, etc. There are a lot of international forums where Pakistan can play a role, like recent UN General Assembly voting where Pakistan took part. So there is a role for Pakistan, but in order to create an informed decision-making process regarding Gaza in Pakistan, it's very important to understand the dynamics of this conflict. And I feel that because it goes without saying that all of the regional countries that I mentioned, they have their own independent reasons to be involved. For example, Iran, their primary goal for being engaged in this conflict is that they would do anything to prevent Israel from disrupting its alleged nuclear weapons program. So if Israel is busy at home in the domestic front or in occupied territories, it will be less likely to pick a kinetic conflict or a fight with Iran, and that gives Iran maybe 10 additional years to do what people suspect they're doing. Then there is Lebanon, right? So Lebanon has its own interests. Lebanon has been sort of at the receiving end of the Israeli military force for the last 50 years. They want to resolve that solution as well. And frankly speaking, Lebanon sees the Israeli actions as a physical existential threat, because if any country Israel can take over militarily in this conflict, is Lebanon. They can't take over Egypt. They can't take over Jordan. They can't take over Syria. But there is only one country in the region which is not militarily equipped to handle itself, to defend itself from an Israeli onslaught. It has happened in the past. It might happen again, right? So the fear in Beirut, in the current contemporary context, would be probably an existential threat, and that is why we see that Lebanon is doing everything it can to not be too involved in the conflict, right? Because that is the underlying fear they have. Then we have Syria. Syria is recently coming out of a brutal, vicious civil war that has raged on for, I would say, around 15 years now, like 10, 15 years. And the Syrian economy is in shambles. But at the same time, there are only a few things which unite Syrians, regardless of which section of the society they are from. If they are part of the ruling elite, if they are part of general public, or if you're a Syrian, there are only a few things that unite you, and one of them is Israel, because Israel is occupying Golan Heights, and quite recently, uh, under Biden presidency, the Israelis have said that we do no longer see Golan Heights as an occupied territory. We see it as part of Israel proper, which means they are usurping that. They've basically done Article 370 uh, in in Golan Heights, right? So, and it means a lot to Syria, because Syria has fought a war over Golan. And if this conflict simmers, it won't escalate into a fireball where five regional countries jump in, their militaries are deployed, they're fighting Israel day and night out. That won't happen, in my opinion. That is unlikely to happen. What will happen is Afghanistan-like situation, post 79 context. That model might be what this new Middle East war might look like, because Syrians want the Golan Heights. The Jordanians, they want the complex. The Lebanese, they want to survive. They want to make sure that they stay on as a country and are not put under occupation. Egyptians, they want to ensure that Israel implodes rather than explodes. That is in the benefit of the Egyptian state, because Egypt is not ready for a large scale conflict, because it itself is coming out of a significantly long period of political instability. So they wouldn't want to engage in a conventional sort of conflict, as they did in 67 or 73. Then we have the sleeping partners. These are your Arab republics, Gulf Cooperation Council countries, who have issued statements, but they are not actively part of anything at the moment. They're not, obviously, they are doing diplomatic efforts to ensure that this conflict comes to an end. There's a ceasefire, there's a humanitarian aid is allowed. The oppression and genocidal tactics that are being used by the Israeli army, they are brought under control, but they haven't taken any steps that would be seen as a disruption in the entire large scale context. Um, one of the significant partners in this conflict would also be Iraq, by the virtue of its association with Iran and Syria. There is a likelihood that Iraq would also play a significant role in this conflict as it evolves. Iraq is not playing a role at the moment, but it is likely that they will. as things progress. Then there is Turkey, and Turkey has its own ambitions. They want to become a regional power. They want to ensure that the Turkey is seen as a leader in the country, it's in the region. Sorry, and Turkey has its own vested interest in the Middle Eastern region, and they have been long-standing interests because um, Turkey, mind you, was governing this entire Levant region for a better part of around 600 years. So they do have history, they have historical claims, and they can't be overlooked. The current modern Turkish state is facing a multi-pronged conflict. It is facing aggression from the European side. It's not being included in the European Union. I mean, there's an interesting situation in which Turkey, being a G20 member state, is not being included in the European Union, but Ukraine, that is bankrupt, they want to include it in the European Union. I mean, that's a bit of a disparity, and Turks are not very happy about it. They don't want to play a leading role in the region. They have historic claims. They have economic interests in Mediterranean and Levant region. And then there's Russia. So as I've noted in my article, the primary interest Russia has is to, number one, gain leverage over Washington, and the best way to do it is through Israel. It's a time-tested strategy. They've done it 2 times before, multiple times in the past. They seem to be doing it again. There's definitely a Russian connection to this, at least in my opinion. And the secondary objective they have is that the Russian state wants to open a second front for the American military-industrial complex, because the military-industrial complex in the U.S. and Europe, they cannot supply Ukraine and Israel simultaneously. One of the reasons is that neither Ukraine or Israel has the economic muscle to fund this war like independent conflicts on their own. Their economies are not strong enough so they can pay for these advanced precision-guided weapons, or Iron Dome systems or arrow systems, or in the case of Ukraine, they are receiving precision-guided munitions from Europe, cruise missiles, and several other high-tech sort of munitions and rockets and missiles from the US, including hopefully soon they will be receiving F-16s. They've received some advanced tanks and armor assets from European countries. So what the Russians appear to be doing is that they are diversifying a conflict they see as a monolithic conflict. They don't see the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza in isolation. They see it as just a different front of the same war. It's another front of the struggle between Moscow and Washington, right? So at some point, again, I've mentioned these thoughts in my article. At some point, the American government, which by itself is facing significant economic challenges, American debt has significantly increased because of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The Chinese economy is posing a significant threat to the growth of the American economy, because China has significantly surpassed the American production, industries, and they're no longer able to compete with China from a cost and value chain point of view. So somewhere down the line, the American government that is facing government shutdowns, they are not able to fund their own offices at the moment, and they're using techniques like quantitative easing, and they've been doing it for the last 20 years since the global financial crisis, in almost 20 years since 2007 and beyond. They will have to realize that whether they want to supply Israel or they want to supply Ukraine, if they choose, and obviously if they have to choose between Ukraine and Israel, they choose Israel, geopolitically speaking, because Israeli lobby is very strong in the U.S., and they have a very significant say in the public policy circles in Washington and other policy capitals in the U.S. and European policy capitals. So this is you must have seen Zelensky has been very desperate in the past 2 to 3 weeks. He's been trying to beg for more money. I saw one of his videos that kind of made me made me made me smile. That he was saying, okay, if you can't give us money, give us a loan. I mean, that tells you where the situation is evolving. If Ukraine is not receiving the love and affection from the European Union and NATO and the US, then that serves a very strategic objective of Moscow. Because if Ukraine is not funded properly, then come summer, 6 months down the track, when the Russian forces might go on an offensive, they will face a much weakened Ukraine. They will not be facing a Ukraine that has, Western ballistic missiles, Western fighter jets, uh, Western advanced technology, access to the, sensors and everything that Americans have deployed there. They might face a much weakened Ukraine, and it will be much easier to neutralize from a Russian point of view. Mind you, Russian goals in Ukraine are not very clear. They have been playing their cards very close to the chest. They haven't really revealed anything on what their war objectives are. It could be to capture Ukraine again and incorporate into Russia, or convert it into a vassal state, again a buffer state, or it could be greater than that. Maybe they will use Ukraine as a staging post to maybe uh, intrude or take over Moldova, which is effectively a Russian outpost at the moment, and several other Eastern European countries. They have several allies in Eastern Europe, like Serbia. Serbia is threatening Kosovo, Bosnia, and Albania now. So these flashpoints in Europe, they are not isolated from what's happening in the Middle East. And my fear is that this conflict, if it is seen in isolation, it will not be properly judged. It will not be properly understood, at least because my sole concern is with Pakistan. So from a Pakistan point of view, it won't be properly understood. And if it is not properly informed and understood, then we cannot create a response that is long term. It's strategic, right? So I believe that the entire idea behind putting this article together was to ensure that a new talking point is created here in Pakistan. So we don't see conflict in Ukraine in isolation from conflict in Gaza. We don't see these conflicts as short-term conflicts, because they are not short-term conflicts. They will definitely escalate eventually in waves, but they will. And also to try and assess what sort of support Pakistan can give from a humanitarian international relations point of view to the people of Gaza that has long-term effects.